Terri, the world was incredulous when the families of the 10 girls shot in the nickel mine schoolhouse nearly 10 years ago approached you within hours and told you they forgave your son and offered their comfort. You've had your own journey that's led to forgiveness, surrender, grace, and redemptive love. But it wasn't immediate and it wasn't easy, was it?
No, nothing about any of this was easy. I mean, in those first days, there wasn't a day that I didn't wake up with tears already streaming down my cheeks before I even had a conscious thought. So nothing was easy about this. And the anguish and the heartbreak was so deep and so much a whole different feeling of life than what I had ever experienced before, because no one can ever prepare themselves or feel like they'd be ready for something like this to happen, because it's just so far beyond anything you would ever anticipate or expect in your life. So yeah, life was very, the idea of forgiveness, hearing it from the Amish, and it's like one of those first nights laying in bed thinking, wow, if they're forgiving my son, do I forgive my son? I was so angry with what he had done. And yet the realization that if I chose not to forgive him, I would have the same hole in my heart that he had. He was full of bitterness and anger. And I knew that that was something I had to forgive him, because I didn't want to live with bitterness toward my son. And so yes, I did forgive him early on. And it is not automatic or without pain when we forgive. Forgiveness frees us to move forward, but it doesn't take away all the pain. It just helps us to know how to navigate the next step. And I feel like that's what God has given me, has given the Amish community, is the ability to take next steps in moving forward in order so that we can meet life and live life. Because I think that's on both sides what we have done. And in staying close to the families, I see them not just surviving, but thriving. And I feel like that's what my husband and I have done also. That it wasn't just, I mean, there were definitely days that you felt like you were in survival mode. Just, can I get through another day? And yet, for me, calling on the Lord's help, just to say, okay, what is my next step? How do I move forward? And he's always given me just what I needed to do that. And with all of us, we all move forward in different ways. Husbands, wives, we're never on the same page at the same time. So that takes massaging relationships of how can we walk into tomorrow and have life become new again. In a whole different way. But I feel like that is what we have done. Made something new. And I feel like that is what God does in our lives when we allow him to, when devastation hits us. And it sure did hit all of us in what I would say was the worst way possible. And anything that's ever happened to me prior to this, I would always look around and say, well, at least this isn't as bad as so-and-so. However, the day that this happened and I laid in bed that night, I said, God, this is the worst thing that I've ever heard of in my life. And my son is responsible for it. If there's anything that you can use from this, you use it, Lord, because I can't imagine anything good ever coming from anything that happened on this day. And I couldn't. I mean, all I could see was darkness. And yet, God did show us ways to have light come back into our lives, which we're very thankful for.
In your book, Forgiven, you talk about your gut-wrenching struggles and nights of anguish in trying to understand how a loving son could do such a depraved thing. And you even question yourself as a mother for not seeing the dark place Charlie was going. Mm-hmm. Talk about how you got beyond that and eventually forgave yourself and your first son.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you go through this soul searching of like, wow, what kind of a mother was I? How could I have raised a son that chose to do something like this? What did I do? What did I do wrong? And then you kind of go through life and you're like, okay, no, I was a good mom, you know? Did I make all the perfect decisions in life? Absolutely not. But I don't think there's a mom or dad out there that has. So then I kind of came to that point of, wow, if you have a son or daughter that's done everything perfect, they've just lived the perfect life, and they've gone to the perfect college, and they've married the perfect person, and they're doing everything right. You can't take all the credit for that because they've made decisions on their own. And likewise, if you have a son or daughter that has caused a lot of pain for yourself or other people, you can't take all the responsibility for that either because they've made adult decisions on their own. So that's where I came to peace with that, in knowing that, wow, we were decent parents. You know, we weren't perfect in any way, shape, or form, but we loved our kids. And yeah, what happened in our son's life was just bizarre and something that we didn't recognize, couldn't anticipate, and yeah, just had to leave it go at that.
As you have noted, the answers died with Charlie.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think led to the place Charlie went before he shot children that he knew and worked among?
I don't have any real answers for that, but I do know that, like, from his suicide notes that he was angry with God over the death of his first daughter, Elise Victoria, and she was a beautiful little baby born 2 months premature. Had she been born today, 10 years later, then, or well, now it'd be 20 years later, but had she been born at a much later time, like now, I think she would have lived, you know, with the technology that we have today. But I just remember seeing my son carrying that little coffin, and he looked like a ghost that day. And yet, I never really checked in with him later to say, how are you doing after this, Charlie? And I don't know at what point in time that started eating away at him, that he felt like it was God's fault that his little baby died. But he blamed God for that, and this was his way of getting back at God, and that makes no sense. And yet, that's what he was claiming. So it makes no human sense in our minds if we try to rationalize that, and yet that's what he was doing.
Even though he had three
beautiful children. I mean, he
after
called
that.
2 of them, you know, 2 kids, he called them back off the bus that day and gave them a hug because he knew what he was about to do. You know, in a mother's mind, I can't fathom how he could look at his own children and then do what he did, but he did. It was our son.
Your path to forgiveness has led you to a close bond with the very Amish families and surviving shooting victims who you once thought would despise you. Talk about that remarkable friendship and how it came to be.
Wow. Well, I remember the first day that we were all gathered together, the two, you know, our families and all the Amish families were gathered together at Bart Fire Hall. I think it was about 5 or 6 weeks after the happening. And the happening is the name that the Amish gave to this event. To me, that is just so gracious, because what happened was the focus became as much or more on forgiveness as it did on the horror of the story. But as our relationship started, as I sat next to Amos and Kate Ebersol, who had lost their only daughter that day. And it's my husband, myself, Amos, and Kate. And just the mingling of our tears as we would be sitting there and just glance at one another, and to know that we were both experiencing the worst kind of sorrow that you can feel, losing family members. And just that day just started something stirring in me that I want to get to know these folks better and just see where our relationship goes. You know, I just kind of sensed that. But it wasn't until the following summer that, my husband and I started visiting the families in January. So everything happened in October. And in January, I talked to my husband about just going and visiting each family. And he's there, hon, I don't know if I can do it. And I said, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and set up 2 appointments to visit them. And he said, okay, but I really don't know if I can. And I said, okay, well, I have a friend that's ex-Amish, and she has offered to go with me if you can't. So that's the way it went. The first visit was to Chris and Rachel Miller that had lost 2 daughters. And as I visited them, my friend Kate went with me. And Chuck, he said, I can't go, I can't do it. And I said, okay. So as we're at Chris and Rachel's, Chris said, so where's Chuck? And I said, it's all too raw and too fresh, and he just couldn't bring himself to come and visit. I think he's afraid he won't be able to make conversation. And I said, and we're supposed to go to Chris and Liz afterwards. And he said, oh, well, if you go there, he said, he won't have any trouble making conversation because Chris is quite a talker. And I said, okay. So when I left there that day, they were so gracious and wonderful. And my friend Kate recommended I take games along for the kids just to break the ice. And that was a wonderful idea. I mean, we just had such warm friendships in those visits. But the second visit, I go home to my husband, and I said, honey, I said, you know, Chris said that this other Chris is really a talker, and you won't have any trouble making conversation. He said, okay, I'll go. So sent my friend Kate home, my husband went with me, and we visited Chris and Liz, and it was just such a precious time. Even with Sarah Ann sitting there, knowing that her skull was just closing up, you know, had just closed up from the wound, and she didn't have to have a plate put in, and but she looked at us so reservedly, and I felt so bad for her because I thought this has got to be so hard for her to see us. But then, as the visit went on, she came over and she talked to us, and it was just visiting that family just really broke the ice for my husband. And then we visited each family, and each visit was so different, but so rich in getting to know them. And then in the summertime, we had a picnic, and they all came. And Junior, the oldest boy in the schoolhouse at the time, he was 22 now, he came up to me at the end of the picnic, and I knew he was suffering from anorexia, you know, just feeling like he had the survivor syndrome of feeling like he should have done something to stop my son. That young man came up at the end of the picnic, held out his hand and said, Mrs. Roberts, thank you so much for inviting us to your home. I had such a good time here today. There's a 14-year-old kid. I was like, wow, this is amazing that he's willing to come to my house. And then to actually express that he enjoyed himself here, it was just, I don't know, that day was just so precious. They all arrived in a yellow school bus, and it was just so amazing. And then, and even this last Christmas, they all arrived in a yellow school bus and sang me Christmas carols after getting out of the hospital. So just wonderful relationships. I still have teas with the mothers. With the girls, the teas stopped about 3 years ago. I was doing a tea just for the girls, and then any new girls that came into the school would also come to the teas. But we stopped those about 3 years ago because they've all graduated and they're getting married and all of that. So their lives have moved on in a different way. But I think maybe this fall I'm going to do a tea for the moms and the daughters together.
And didn't you even have a tea for the grandmothers?
Yes, yes. I had a tea for the grandmothers. That was the first year. And my friend Sherry had helped with that. And that was a really precious time. Just all these grandmas. It was a horrible snowy day, and they all came, you know. It was just so precious. And they sang, and it's just so precious hearing them sing their a cappella. It's, yeah, there's nothing like that. So, but they sang for us, yeah.
Do you still spend time every Thursday with Rosanna King, the girl most severely injured in the shooting and sent home to die? What grace does that bring you? Okay. The first 2 times I went to see Rosanna, it was a year after, and after I had had the tea, I asked her mother if it would be helpful if I came
and visited once a week. And she said, yes, that would be wonderful. So that's what I started doing. Every week I went to Rosanna's. The first 2 weeks I went, I got in my car. I held my composure while I was there, and she was still in pretty bad shape in after that first year. The positioning of her hands and her feet, and tense. She's not that tense now, but it was hard. And when I got in the car, I cried the whole way home. Sat in my garage and just cried and cried. Second week, did the same thing, and I'm sitting there in my garage, and I said, Lord, I thought you were calling me to do this and be there with this child. But I can't do this on my own. I can't be a basket case every week I go there, because I knew emotionally that would just rip me apart. And so then the third week I went, I did not shed a tear. And God gave me the grace to be there and to be in that moment. And I was able to, back then I would hold her and rock her and sing to her, read to her, and help her with baths. And that's, I still help her with baths. I just don't hold her anymore, because now she'll be 16 this fall, so next month. And she's a beautiful young girl. I do not go every week anymore. I went every week until 2 years ago, when I was re-diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Then I cut it back to every other week. And right now, I'm actually wearing a body brace all the time, and I'm not able to drive or anything. So I'm not visiting her right now, but I'm still hoping that that's something I'll get back to doing. So we'll see.
Do you think, as someone suggested, that perhaps God allowed this for Rosanna to serve as a constant reminder of that awful day in the schoolhouse? And if so, in what way?
I don't want to answer for God. Has He allowed? She does serve as a reminder of the harshness of what had happened. She is a beautiful young woman. She still does not walk or talk. When I enter the home, her greeting is, and knowing that I'm there, she hears my voice, she sees me. I don't know. I don't really have an answer for that. I know God allows things that we totally do not understand. And I know for myself, I have come to that point of saying, okay, Lord, I do not understand your ways, but I will trust them. And I would say with Rosanna, her life is certainly not what a 16-year-old's life should be. And her family is amazing in the measures that they go to make life as good as it can be for Rosanna. And so God has allowed this to happen for sure. And I think all things can be used for His good purpose when we allow them to do that. So I do believe that her parents have just surrendered this to the Lord. And are there hard days? Absolutely. If Rosanna's having a seizure, we all have a rough day. But by God's grace, she is still here on this earth for whatever purpose and plan.
You spend much time giving talks about your journey and from unspeakable pain to love and inner peace. Why do you choose to relive that pain, and what is your message to others who suffer and hold anger? How do you make the choice to forgive?
Okay. I guess for myself, and having had the responses now from so many, in having gone through what I've gone through, and then when I can look into the eyes of someone that's experiencing deep, deep pain, there's something about what I've experienced that anybody can relate to. And whatever their situation is, it's like mine was of, okay, might not be as bad as so-and-so, but when people look into my eyes and they know the pain that I've gone through, it somehow gives them hope to meet tomorrow. It would be a whole lot easier to never tell my story again, because it does stir up the emotion in the heart. Even sitting here with you today, and this is 10 years later, The pain's different now than it was then, but it is still difficult. But I do say, even knowing that I may be on death's door any day, I know that I will continue to tell this story until the day that I die, because I see lives changed. And I see people with bitterness toward family members or someone in their life that has abused them be able to choose to forgive, be able to walk into tomorrow with a freedom that they may not have experienced in years. And when those stories come back to me, it's like, wow, I will tell this story till the day that I die, because it is touching lives in a very positive way to say, yeah, my darkness is dark, but I can meet tomorrow. This is not the end. My whole story isn't written yet. So whatever anyone's pain is and their darkness, there is a tomorrow, there is hope, and there can be a happy ending to each of our stories when we choose to surrender our lives and allow God to show us the next step.